Oh, I'll stop whistling. Okay. The little red button went live. I thought I should stop whistling.
Hello, everyone. I just realized my mic was muted. That's what's so much fun about being live. You never know what's going to happen. So again, I'm Shamel Jordan. Maybe you were reading the closed captions. That happens sometimes. So
I thought it was my hearing aid. Okay.
Thanks a lot for you guys helping me out. So I'm Shamel Jordan, and I'm the host of Genealogy Quick Start, which is a show that is on Philly Cam. And Jim just disappeared. And today we have a fabulous show. We have two shows in one. The first will be Immigration and Naturalization Myths. We're going to have that with Jim Beidler and Michael John Neill. Additionally, the second half hour, we're going to have Transcribing Foreign Records. And I'm told, Katie is telling me that you do not need to know a foreign language to be able to transcribe foreign records. So I'm really interested in knowing how to do that. So let's bring in our guest today. Today we have some wonderful folks. Let's bring Jim back. I think Jim wants to be Jim. Hello. Hello, Jim. Hello, Michael. Hello, Katie.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome. So how's everyone's day going?
Mine's been better. I just had a bread mishap. So I was baking some bread, as a lot of people are doing during quarantine, and it kind of overflowed out of the bread machine. So as I said before,
why people would decide bread. Like if we're not moving much, why would we decide to make bread? Like they say Americans are afraid of bread when we travel to other countries, but now we're all bread makers. Why do you think that is?
That is a very good question. For me personally, I have an Austrian husband, and Austrians are obsessed with bread. So to keep him happy, I'm trying to make bread, but I need to do a better job.
So today we're going to go ahead and get started quickly with our first half hour, and that's going to be talking about immigration and naturalization myths. So are there really myths? I mean, you know, I thought everything that everyone said was true. Like,
well, we don't have time for that whole conversation. So we're going to stay focused today on things dealing with immigration and naturalization. That other is way beyond our scope today. And greetings to those,
beyond our pay grades. Yes.
Exactly. And greetings to those who are saying hello. We're seeing that. We're glad you're with us today. We appreciate that.
So we're going to get started with our, because we have a lot of them. Like I didn't realize there were so many myths. Like I thought I know the first couple, but I didn't know all these other ones were myths. So you're going to bust some for me
and we're only scraping the top of the barrel with these. So
we're not even getting below the crust today. So we probably, we should.
Sorry. So let's go ahead and get started with the immigration and naturalization myths. And the first one is name changed at Ellis Island.
This is one that really just keeps popping up over and over again. And a few things you got to remember about Ellis Island during the time that it was an active port of arrival for many future Americans. You had to have paperwork to get on the ship when you left Europe. Most of the immigrants that are coming through New York were coming from Europe. You had to have paperwork to leave your country. You had to have permission to leave. You had to pay to get on the ship. There weren't as many stowaways as people sometimes would like to believe. And when you landed, you had to have your paperwork to get into Ellis Island. Some individuals were quarantined if you were sick, and there were translators for just about every language or a dialect close enough to your language that the individual could help you. And so your name would be taken off of your paperwork. Now, could a letter get changed? Could it be slightly misspelled? Could the SCH in your name become SH? Sure. But
it wasn't a conspiracy to
it was not a conspiracy.
Anglicize people's names.
No, and if your ancestor did change his or her name, most likely were that if it was done officially, and some would do it unofficially when they settled somewhere, if there were too many persons or Hansons, they would just decide to become John Fenufferman or whatever it was to be a little more distinct. They would do that informally in some cases, or the time they would usually do it formally, if it was done formally, was when they naturalized, as is on the graphic. I think that individual, he emigrated in 1914, didn't naturalize until the 30s. His Greek name, which I'm going to try to pronounce as best I can, Panagiotis was the first name, Veracruz. He's listed as Panagiotis in just about everything, but when he naturalizes, it says there in the bottom, you can see it underlined in red. From now on, I want to be referred to as Peter Veracruz. And from that point in time, every document referred to him as Peter with his first name. Did it get misspelled once in a while? Sure, because it was Greek to everybody, because it was Greek. But a slight misspelling is not a name change. Yeah, because anybody can have a slight misspelling.
Yeah. What I see, if I may interrupt, what I see is that people later in life, they changed themselves, and but when their grandchildren come up to them and say, "Grandpa, why did Schwarzenheffer become Blackenheffer," something like that? And what is Grandpa going to say? "Oh, I was ashamed of having this hard to pronounce name," No, he's going to say the dipstick bureaucrat at Ellis Island changed it for me, and that's what we're stuck with. So, yeah.
So, yep.
Yep.
So that's myth one about the name change. I hear that one all the time. So let's move on. We've busted that myth, down with that myth. Let's move on to our next myth, which is myth number 2, which is that German-speaking people always use the same naming pattern. Talk to us about that, Jim. What does that mean?
What that means is while there are patterns of the order in which people gave the given names to their children, usually honoring ancestors, and while there are for certain parts of Germany and certain time periods some general protocols or templates, that we're going to show you, it's not applicable to absolutely every place in Germany. And a lot of things with German genealogy, it breaks down first wave versus second wave. First wave of immigrants coming to America is everything up until about the Revolution. Second wave pretty much gained steam after the Napoleonic Wars, 1820 to the end of World War I. So during the first wave, the people coming from the German states basically from the 1500s, when the church records begin, through the 1700s, in many places of Germany, all the boys would get the name Johann or Hans as kind of a prefix name. Women would get Anna or Maria. And then the middle name is the Rufname. The call literally means call name. And that's what they would use. So they might be baptized Johann Samuel, and they would go as Samuel for the rest of their lives. So this all applies to the first waivers. They come to America. They pretty much withhold that through the 1700s into the early 1800s, and then give way to more American naming traditions, like using a mother's maiden name as the middle name, or using the first name and not this middle name like the other. But then your second waivers. In the 1800s in Germany, they start mostly baptizing children with 3 given names. Yeah, let's just add to the potato salad here, and what comes out of that is, who's going to introduce themselves with 3 given names throughout the rest of their life? No, they will usually pick 1 or maybe 2 for general usage. As far as I've been able to figure out, there's not a particular pattern whether they use the first given name or the second given name or the final one consistently. So you're really, if they're baptized Karl Ernst Ludwig, they can be Karl, they can be Ernst, they can be Ludwig. So
lots of fun with those German names. Let's move on to myth 3, which is a family feud is the only reason 2 brothers spelled their names differently. It's not a feud? They weren't feuding?
Well, if I had a nickel for every time somebody has either told me or sent me an email saying, "Oh, and yeah, my great-great-grandfather and his brother, they had this feud, and so one spelled it with the E and the other spelled it without the E." Okay, we go back to, if you were on our webinar 2 weeks ago, when I said the biggest concept you can get into your head is that it's not how your ancestors spelled their name, it's how it was being spelled for them by a census taker, by a courthouse clerk, or tax collector, what have you. And so this applies to ones where the family ends up with 2 or even maybe 3 different spellings of the surname. And if you get as many records about them, you'll find they didn't really change their names in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, it's going to be spelled back and forth inconsistently.
Can I ask you a question about the first waiver, second waiver? So,
yes.
Diana Ritchie said her Germans came over in 1840. So which wave is she?
She'd be the kind of the beginning of the second wave. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And if go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, because you knew I had to add an Ostfriesian comment. I was going to add that anything with naming patterns and naming traditions, you want to make sure there can be slight differences from one area of Germany to another. So when you've researched in one area and you've got a good feel for how the naming works and how many names they're using and what the traditions are, keep in mind, if you're moving a couple 100 miles one way or another, it may still be a German area, but some of those cultural differences may slightly change the more common practices. So just make sure that you're aware of that when you're
in Ostfriesland, they use the patronymics until when? Mid-1800s? Or
officially, Napoleon said you got to cut this out in 1811.
Oh, okay.
But given their stubborn nature, it continued through the 1850s. And what they would do, they would pick a last name, and then the patronym would be a middle name.
Are you saying no Frisians were stubborn?
Ever so slightly, but we're not gonna go down that rabbit hole today either. But
and very sharp. But
yeah.
All right, let's move on to myth number 4. You had to naturalize.
People sometimes think that your relative was forced to naturalize. Now, there were reasons why your ancestor might have naturalized. If he or she wanted to vote, you had to be a citizen. If they wanted to file for a homestead under the United States Homestead Act, they had, by the time they got done with the application process, they had to have completed their naturalization. In some jurisdictions, in some time periods, if you wanted to sue somebody, you had to be a naturalized American citizen. If you were an unregistered, if you were an alien, you could not sue somebody. So those are all reasons why your ancestor might have naturalized. There's, if your ancestor was going to go back to Europe for a visit, as one of mine did in the 1870s, he naturalized 2 months before he went back on a return visit. I think so he wouldn't be conscripted in the Prussian army. But you could often buy land, you could sell land, you could bequeath land in a will, and if that's what your ancestor was focused on, the acquisition of property in his own name, selling it, doing those kinds of things with it, he might have chosen never to naturalize. It all goes back to what were the rights of a citizen, and which of those rights did your ancestor have an interest in utilizing?
Makes sense.
It goes back to that.
Let's move on to Myth 5. Official records only contain official names, no nicknames.
Yeah, tell me about it. So in the chat, Kay Richard pointed out that we go back to the 1800s, 1700s. There wasn't some official agency that was keeping track of the names in the same way that we do now. And the import of this is that in many, I mean, the Germans are what I'm most familiar with, and the distinctive thing about many of their nicknames is they form them by lopping off the first syllable of the word rather than the second syllable. You know, we have a name like Samuel that becomes Sam. Well, the Germans, Niklaus becomes Klaus. Antonius becomes Tonius. Hermanus may become Manus. And among women, Christina, Steen, Katharina, Trine. And you will find these nicknames littered all over church records, tax lists, especially in records in Germany. But no, it's not like today where using a new name could create all kinds of paperwork problem. Right. If it's 1850, you might move to a new town, you might choose a different name, and as long as you were doing nothing illegal, which may be why you chose to change your name, but you didn't have to go officially have a court order of changing your name like you would have to today. It's a whole different, it's a whole different situation.
I have one letter in my name that is different that my mom changed in kindergarten. I remember it was a big day. She was like, look, we're going to now spell your name like this. And she added another E. And I had problems with E's and threes and D's and B's. Like, I don't know if that's some kind of diagnosis or anything, but it is huge. Just one letter right now. But back in the day, you could just kind of freely do what you want. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'd need an advanced degree to diagnose you. So I think I'll take a pass. But.
All right, so that was myth with the, let's see, next. So we did that one. Myth number 6. World War II Allied bombing destroyed most of the records in Europe. That sounds like the Civil War that they burnt down the courthouses.
Jim, are you there?
Uh-oh.
I think we've lost him, so I guess this is his myths, but since he's not here, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and wing it.
Thank you.
One of the things we have in Germany, in German records, is what's called the Kirchenbuch Duplikat. It's a duplicate copy of the church book, and those weren't kept at the original parish where the church records were created and maintained by the priest or pastor. They were sent to a regional or a district archives. And so, if there was bombing and the church records were destroyed for one reason or another, there very well could be a duplicate copy. We're not going to make you spell Kirchenbuch Duplikat, and I may be mispronouncing it a little bit, but there was that handwritten duplicate copy of the records in addition to the original. original records. So you want to make sure you've looked for all of those if you're told that the original church records were destroyed, because as Jim mentioned when we had the informal discussion of this earlier, sometimes an archivist or a pastor or whomever saying, "We don't have those records," is just, they were destroyed in the war, is just nobody wants to discuss the war. Oh, it's the war, so I'm not going to touch that.
Yeah.
When they really could be there, or they could be a duplicate copy of that. So you want to make certain that they really were destroyed, or there's not a copy of them somewhere. And that's why it's really good for any geographic area where you're researching, be it Germany or wherever, to try to find others that are working in that same village or that same pretty small micro area, if you will. May not be related to you, they probably are, but even if they're not related to you, they will be familiar with where the records are at and where they're kept. And those are people you want to reach out to, because they may be able to help you find those records when the pastor or the priest just says, "They bombed during the war, they're gone." You know, which translation means I don't want to crawl up or down or wherever and go look for them. You know, but there could be, even if they were destroyed, there could have been that Kirchenbuch duplicate, if you will, in a regional or a district archive somewhere.
And just like marriage, evidence of a marriage, you know, that goes into so many different, you know, books, etc., that you want to just kind of keep moving forward. So I think this next one is yours. Good,
because I don't know what good. Everyone knew their status. This sounds like it could apply to a lot of things, but we're going to speak about naturalization and citizenship status. And particularly in that time period before 1920 and the early 20th century, when there was hard legislation that formalized a lot of things in terms of naturalization and citizenship. But for immigrants that came over in the 19th century, particularly latter part of the 19th century, many of those individuals, if their father naturalized when they were a minor child themselves, even if they weren't born here, but if their father naturalized and they were a minor child, they were naturalized via proxy, if you will, through their father's naturalization, and they did not have to naturalize in their own name. Sometimes if you look at voters' registration records, you may see a reference, there may be a column in some locations for where they were naturalized, and sometimes they'll say naturalized, sometimes they'll call it congressional act, sometimes it'll say naturalized via father's naturalization. But the reason, in terms of the myth, what can happen sometimes is if the father naturalized when the children were very small, and say the father died shortly after that, you know, and records were lost and this and that and whatever, when they were adults, they might not have known what their true citizenship status was. I've got a great-great-grandfather that I'm pretty convinced his father never naturalized. He filed the intent, which is those first papers, but for reasons we won't get into, I don't think the father chose to naturalize. And his three sons, but they believed their father naturalized, and they believed they were naturalized via his naturalization, when in fact they probably weren't naturalized at all.
So did they, okay, so if they weren't naturalized, does that mean that they just behaved like citizens?
Some of them would, or if it became an issue and they weren't sure, some of them would just naturalize, like they just go through the process again. If they weren't sure and it became an issue, or they couldn't find father's records, if they knew father was naturalized or thought he was and couldn't find his records, then what they would have to do, or what they could choose, is just go through the process themselves.
Okay.
If for some reason they were concerned about that.
Okay, so the children followed the father, and the father and the wife followed the father as well until after 1920.
Correct. Cable Act separated. The Cable Act, it takes a divorce to separate a husband and wife, but in terms of citizenship, the Cable Act of the 1920s separated their citizenship status and made it. I
thought it was interesting that if an American woman married a foreign person, that then they would lose their citizenship before
during that time period. Specifically, 1906 was when federal statute said you are one in terms of citizenship status, the husband and wife. And then in the Cable Act of the early 1920s, it separated that out, because what it did was, like you mentioned, a native-born woman would lose her citizenship if her Swedish husband refused to naturalize, and then she wouldn't be a citizen. And so that was the cause for that. And so because before 1906, the laws were kind of vague and they sometimes were interpreted in different ways, people were uncertain. That was why there was legislation in 1906 to kind of clear some of that up, the muddied waters.
Very interesting knowing the law. So when a woman lost her naturalization, or was there a separate record that was created for that?
Some of them could file. There was a process they could go through to try to get their citizenship status back.
No, but I mean, when they lost it, is there a record that says this is a list of women who, people who have lost their citizenship?
No, there wouldn't be a list of that. The clue to that is you'll see them in I'm thinking of the one, was it a 1920 census? She's born in New York, but it says she's an alien.
Okay.
Yeah. And she actually had for her, it was because she married a Greek. Her neighbor was a Wisconsin-born alien because she had married a Japanese man.
Okay. And so
and that also gets into which nationalities were allowed to naturalize during what time periods. Kind of a separate issue, all wrapped together in one big messy ball of string.
So if you could just go through, I'm gonna put you solo. If you could just go through like. These are the myths, name change at Ellis Island. German speaking people always so they didn't do that. No,
and to kind of add one little thing to what Jim had to, to add one little thing to what Jim had to say about that, if the pattern of, first son is for this person's father, second son for this person's father, and the daughters for mothers, and so on and so forth. Some areas did tend to use that. Some areas didn't tend to use that. The joke I always make with that is, what if both grandfathers were named Johann? Then what are you going to do? You're going to have Johann. But just kind of watch that. Family Feud is the only reason. Brothers can spell names differently. Usually it's just a spelling error or distinction with a clerk, as Jim said, and for one reason, one family, because that's how it got spelled in one record, they just stuck with it. It wasn't really, the Family Feud is kind of exaggerated because people like drama, and so they'll create drama where there is none. That never happens today, but it used to happen. That was supposed to be a joke. That's the one bad thing about not being able to see people when I do one of these, is that I really can't get a feel for if they're getting the jokes or not. But again, the things that we mentioned here, we mentioned these things kind of in the context of, we can't do a totally 100% comprehensive discussion of any of these. It's to make you aware, remind you, and to stress the importance of, if you're unaware of these things, yeah, I need to go look and find out more.
Exactly.
More about this. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. And what I get from the myths is that don't stop. There's opportunities to there. You never know where you might be able to find stuff. So that's what I really liked about your myths, is that, and also don't get hung up on like why things might be the way that they are. Like we talked about this before, spelling does not count in genealogy. No. If you kind of know some of these naming tricks that kind of like, if you're German, Jim gave us some, I'm sure other ethnicities have different naming patterns. So learn more about that particular culture, and that can help you to understand more where to go.
That can help you tremendously. And I do appreciate at least one comment. Diana Ritchie did laugh at my joke, so that makes me feel a whole lot better.
You have a fan.
Yeah. I've met her in the real world a few times.
So this person, Haywood 115 said that they had a direct ancestor who filed his intent in Newark, New Jersey, some in root papers in Albany, New York, and final papers in Buffalo, New York. Talk to us about that.
That can easily, it kind of depends on, what their migration trail was. But for some, they were told to file your intent as soon as you landed, even if that wasn't your permanent area of residence. So oftentimes they might settle. I've got individuals that were going to homestead, but they were in Illinois for a few years. They filed their declarations of intent in Illinois and then went to Nebraska to homestead and completed the completed the homestead, completed the naturalization in Nebraska. So it did happen. There were others that came and landed and stayed and did all their paperwork in one spot. But there were other movers that might have spent a few years, moving around a little bit to get settled, as a lot of people did. And so there's the beginning paperwork sitting there in those other places, and then the final paperwork maybe is where they finally stayed, or maybe not, because some people just can't stay anywhere for more than 2 years. That just happens sometimes.
So, Michael, thank you so much. Your friend Jim, his computer, he's restarting his computer, so he'll be back and he'll. Yep. He kind of warned us that some things might be happening with him, but I really appreciate you, Michael. You want to say hi to your fans?
Thank you.
So tell us how people can get in touch with you.
Probably the easiest way is to go to genealogytipoftheday.com. It's all one big address. You need the www, but just genealogy tip of the day, spelled the correct way to spell genealogy. And there's contact information there, more information about me and the Facebook page and getting the tip of the day and those kinds of things for anybody.
And Jim's back, Jim. Welcome back, Jim.
I was a myth for about 5 minutes.
You was a myth, the legend. He's back. So, Jim, how can people get in touch with you?
They can get in touch with me at my website, jamesmbeidler.com. How about that?
All right. So let us get ready to go on. Hello, Katie. We're going to now do transcribing records. And I'm going to have Michael just kind of peek out on the side for a second. Welcome, Katie. How are you?
I'm doing good. I enjoyed listening to all the myths. I get to learn a lot of new things as well.
So, Katie, tell us a little bit about you.
So I am a German translator. So I see a lot of names I know in the chat. So welcome to everyone that I know. And for those of you who don't know me, I work with the old German handwriting. So I translate letters, diaries, church records, vital records, pretty much anything historical related to help people find their ancestors.
Okay, so you're saying you do transcriptions, but you're going to show us, as people who don't do transcriptions, you're sure that we'll be able to do some transcriptions based off of not being able to speak the language?
Yes, I'm going to give you my best tips. So I am self-taught, and through all my years of experience, I've picked up a lot of tips along the way, and I love to teach. So I'd love to share these tips with you all.
Fantastic. So let's go ahead and get started with step 1, which you say is to download the entire page. So, okay. Oops, hold on, Jim. Hold on. Download the entire page. So talk to us about that.
Yes, let me scoot over this way a little bit. This is so important. I have so many clients who, when they're sending me their ancestors record, will just send me their specific ancestors entry in a church book or something like that. And I always write back and say, please send me the rest of the page, all the rest of the entries and the page. And this is so important because it gives you a larger handwriting sample. So if there's certain letters in your ancestors record that are really hard to recognize, you're going to want to try to find that same sort of shape or that same sort of cross or something like that to help you figure out what it is. And if you have the entire page, you have a lot more options to work with rather than just your ancestors record.
So okay, I definitely get that. So if you can see how they write their E's all the time,
exactly.
Or you can get an example of that. Okay, that makes sense. So get the entire page.
Right. And then there's another reason that's important as well. And that is to help you understand what the category of the word is. Because when you're transcribing, it can be really difficult to figure out what is this word from the hundreds of thousands of possibilities it might actually be. But if you know you're looking at an occupation or a town or a verb or an adjective, the list in your mind becomes a lot more narrow and it becomes easier to decipher. So if you have other records to work with, you'll be able to kind of figure out the formatting. And I'll show you an example of what I mean in a minute.
Okay, I think we have an example here. And let me get rid of Jim. Sorry, Jim.
Okay, so this is one example. If you can put the 2 arrows, I think I have on there.
Oops, I don't have 2 arrows.
Okay.
Tell me where I should be highlighting, like
the 2 underline words.
This one.
Yeah, we don't really need them. It's just if everyone can look at the 2 underline words, the one's on the first record and one's at the second record. And let's say that your record is the top record and you're trying to figure out that word and that handwriting looks just too confusing for you. You can then go to the record below and maybe that looks a little bit easier. It's only 3 letters. Oops, we skipped. Yep.
Is that where I should be?
No, the one before.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah. So the one below, that underlined word below in that bottom record is only 3 letters. And maybe that word is a little bit easier for you to decipher than the one in your record. And if you could figure it out, you'd figure out that that word is Mai, M-A-I, which in German is the word May. So now you know that that word is May. It's the first word in the record. It's underlined. So if you go to your own record, which is that tricky word is also the first word, is also underlined, chances are that's also the month. So by figuring out the word below, you're now able to narrow down your choices above.
Oh, okay. Got that. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That is pretty darn cool. I feel like I know something now. Like I know what. So was that German?
That was German. Yeah, there is German handwriting can be very tricky, but if it is called Kurrentschrift, and you can easily get a key online. So if anyone wants the key afterwards, just let me know, and I can tell you where to get that. This is another example of how having the whole record can work for you. So this is, let's say your ancestors' record is the second record. So can you go to the next slide?
Yes.
So, and you don't have my underlines on here?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. Let's see. Nobody can see my arrow though, right, either? Okay, it's okay. So let's say we're looking at the column on the very right-hand side, and we're trying to figure out that bottom word, the word on the very bottom of the record. And this word actually cuts off between lines. So the third and the fourth line of the bottom record, it's a long word for you to try to figure out. So if you go to the record above, that word is a little bit shorter, that last word on that record. And let's say you figured it out and you were able to figure out that that word is Häusler, and that means cottager. So it's an occupation. So because these records were formatted the same from record to record, you now know that that last word in your own ancestors' record is an occupation as well. So then you could go to a German occupation list, or you can try to figure out, based on some Googling, what that word could be. So knowing whether it's an occupation, whether it's a town, whether it's a name, really helps your brain to kind of get a better idea of what that word is.
Categories are pretty cool.
Yeah.
So we just did this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go on to step 2, which is scan the document for headings and stamps.
Yeah, this is an important one. So if we can go to the next slide. This kind of relates to what I've been talking about of how categories are so important. So in addition to using other records and the placement of words in other records to figure out the category, you can also use the headings. And those are usually a lot easier because those headings are usually in a typed font. So whatever your record may be, whatever language, German, Italian, Dutch, whatever, look at those headings and translate them first, because then you'll know what type of information you're looking for in the column below. And I promise you, it really is so much easier to transcribe if you have an idea of what you're looking for. So use the formatting trick between records, but translate the headings first, and that will give you a huge head start.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I love trying to figure out what the headings are. And then you have talking about stamps. I love this one. So
yes.
Tell us, you said you had a little story about this one.
Right. So this is actually the #1 rule of translation. If you ever take a translating class or a language class and you're learning to be a translator, they will always tell you, read the entire document first before you start translating. And I don't know if I should admit this or not, but sometimes I get a little bit lazy and I don't always read the entire document. And I usually just start translating right at that first sentence. And this has come back to get me because one time, a couple of times actually, I've gotten stuck on a word and I've tried to figure it out and figure it out. And from the context, I realized that it was a town. And I probably spent about 45 minutes trying to figure out this dumb town that I couldn't get, only to get to the bottom of the document. And there was a nice printed stamp there with the town name that had taken me a half an hour to transcribe in printed text. So I always tell people now, and I tell myself, always look at the whole document first and see if there's any stamps, any headings, anything printed that will give you clues to what those handwritten words could be.
Yep. Pretty good. Step 3 is to change your Microsoft Word language.
Yes, this is one of my favorite tips. So a lot of times you're not going to know the language that you're transcribing, and you're not going to be able to tell if your transcription is right or wrong. So a way to help you get around that is to change the language of Microsoft Word, where you're maybe typing your document, into the language of your record. And you can do this by just going to language and changing it right up there. It's a very easy Google search. If you type change Microsoft Word language for Windows, for Mac, it'll tell you then and there how to do it. But once you change it, then I think you can go to the next slide.
I have the arrows.
Great. Okay. So let's say this is your record. This is a Dutch record. And you're trying to transcribe that word with the arrow. And let's say it looks to you like Overledey. And you're not sure if that word is correct or not. So after changing Microsoft Word to Dutch, you type it in, and the word is underlined in red. So that likely means that your transcription guess is incorrect. But Microsoft Word, luckily, doesn't leave us high and dry. You can then right-click on the red underlined word, and it will give you examples of what that Dutch word actually may be. So you can look at those examples, look back at your word, and kind of narrow down what you think that last letter is. Or you can just go to an online dictionary, type in all those examples, and see which one makes sense with the context of your document. And this one is actually overleden, which apparently means to pass away in Dutch.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, on to step 4. Start transcribing.
Sure. I did actually want to say one more thing to step 3. Sure. With genealogical documents, a lot of times there are a lot of old-fashioned words that might not be in the Microsoft Word dictionary. So if your word is underlined and you do this trick and you still can't find the definition, but you're 99% sure that you transcribed it correctly, consider the fact that it may be an old-fashioned word, and that's when you need to go to an old-fashioned dictionary. But for modern words, it works well.
I love a reason to buy books.
Me too.
All right, let's move on to step 4, start transcribing.
Oh, no, this is the fun part. So you've looked at, you have your whole page or multiple pages if you're really good. You've scanned the document for your headings, for your stamps, so you don't make the same mistakes that I have. And your Microsoft Word language is in the language of your record. So now you can actually start transcribing. And a lot of times I like to tell people to try to find a key for the handwriting online. So you can, again, everything's available on Google nowadays. So find your key. And then once you start transcribing, no matter how good you are, I guarantee you there will be a word that trips you up. I do this every single day, and it happens to me every single day, that there's always that one tricky word. But luckily, there's a great website for when that happens. And as anyone has been on my webinars know, I talk about this every webinar because I love this website so much. And this is wordmine.info. So this website will help you to kind of play hangman with your words. You can write down the letters that you recognize and leave blanks for the letters that you don't. Type them into WordMine, and it will fill in the blanks for you and show you all the words in that language with those letter combinations. So here, the last word down, so on the third line, the first word, let's say we couldn't read that word, and this is a Danish record. So we can maybe recognize, oops, go one more back.
Oh, sorry.
We can maybe recognize the A-T-T-E-R at the end, but that first letter looks a little tricky. So then we can go to wordmind.info. So now we can go to the next slide, type it in, and at the top where it says search type, you can change it to words starting with or words ending in. So if you recognize the first or the second half of the word, that's how you can kind of narrow it down. But here we recognize the end. So we typed in A-T-T-E-R, made sure our Danish was selected, and pressed search. And we ended up with 103 Danish words ending in author. So if we don't speak Danish, that's a ton of words to look up in the dictionary. So can you go to the next slide? So luckily, WordMine allows us to narrow it down. So you can count the number of letters in that handwritten word. And I always tell people to put one less letter and one more letter than you actually see, because with any handwritten document, that handwriting can be either elongated or squished together. So we put 4 to 6 letters, and that ended up with 9 Danish words. Now, that's a lot more manageable than 103. So we could then either look all of these words up in the dictionary, or you can narrow it down even more, because I'm sure some of the letters won't match up with that mystery letter at the beginning. But this really gives you a good head start into figuring out what that mystery word or mystery letter is. All right, and then once you're done with WordMine, or if you have something else that's giving you trouble, I always recommend using Google, because Google will be very nice sometimes and actually suggest the right transcription for the word that was giving us trouble. This example comes from a document I was transcribing a few months ago. And for anyone who speaks German, you'll recognize Mariengemeinde, which means Marian Parish, Parish Church. And the second word that was confusing me was Seeloskirche, which is some kind of church. And I've never heard the word Seelos before, so I knew I probably wasn't correct in my transcription. So I typed it into Google, and I put that word Mariengemeinde, so the Marian Parish, before it to give Google as much context as I possibly could. And sure enough, when I hit enter, Google corrected my transcription for me, changing that E to a C, which is the word Schlosskirche, which means the palace church, or the church of a palace or castle, which made a lot more sense than what I had thought the word was. So a lot of times, if you don't know what your transcription is, type it into Google and see, one, if Google verifies your result for you by giving you the results, like a Wikipedia entry or something like that. Or two, if it says, did you mean, or showing results for, and then that would actually be your correct transcription.
I love that. I love, love, love. I heard Jim, that one's the price of gold right there. The word mine is pretty neat.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. All of these tips are really good. And, when you were talking about trying to get an archaic dictionary, I know for German, there's one that's even online. You don't have to buy the book. From the Brothers Grimm. They had the leading German dictionary of the 19th century, and that now is a version of that is online. So I'm sure with other languages there probably are such dictionaries also. Yeah,
that's a great source for German for sure.
So Katie, I just want you to run through your steps one more time. And then I'm going to ask you a question that I don't know if Jim might need to hold you down, because someone might ask you a question.
I think I know what that question might be. to do a recap of the steps. 1, make sure you download the entire page. So not just your ancestors record, but as many records as you can. If you can download more than one page, do that. The more handwriting sample, the more formatting samples you have, the better. Number 2, before you start transcribing, scan your documents for any headings so you can figure out the categories of the words you're looking for, and any stamps so you can figure out any towns, any dates that might come up in the handwriting, and those printed texts will give you a head start on what those handwritten words are. Number 3 is to change your Microsoft Word language to the language you're working with. And this will help you to double check your transcription and get some ideas for what your word might be if you happen to transcribe it incorrectly. And then number 4 is when you start transcribing, make sure to take advantage of WordMine and Google search results. And that will help you to kind of, again, double check yourself or give you some ideas that you might not have thought of. You can do it. I have faith in all of you. Like I said, I taught myself, so if I can do it, you can definitely do it.
I love your encouragement. I love that. I love that. So the question is, you know, you showed us that you could change your Microsoft language. You showed us Google. How come I can't just take the whole document and just, you know, type it all into Google and call it a day?
Yes, and the reason we were laughing about this earlier is if you ask a translator why you can't use Google Translate, that's our number one least favorite question. But it is a good question, and it's a question that a lot of people have. So to answer it, Google can definitely be helpful for words and phrases. If you're looking at short words like brother or parents or things like that, Google Translate will definitely help you out. But if you're doing anything longer, a lot of times it will translate things literally, and different languages they have different grammar. So maybe the verbs go at the end in their language, or maybe adjectives go after the noun in their language. So it will kind of mix things up in a way that might not make sense in English. They are getting better all the time. And if you are going to use a machine translation, one I recommend more than Google Translate is a website called DeepL. That's DEEPL.com. And that's actually a little bit more accurate than Google Translate, but you do need to be careful with idioms. So like in English, we have the idiom to hit the hay, which means to go to sleep. And Google.
I thought you said to hit the head. I was like, whoa.
Oh, no. That's hit the head. To hit the hay. I think that's I don't know if that's just something my family said, but I think that's a normal idiom. It's time to hit the hay. And if you type that into a machine, that might say, you know, to punch the straw, and it wouldn't take into account the idiom. Or it's raining cats and dogs might make you think cats and dogs are literally falling from the sky. So if you don't, no, I mean, maybe we never know nowadays, but yeah, you just need to be careful that machines don't always understand the figurative meaning of language.
And Katie Janice Allison says, hello.
Hello, nice to see you. Janice and I have realized we have a lot in common. We went to, she came from the town where I went to college. So she's one of my handwriting course students, and it's nice to see you on here, Janice.
Fantastic. Welcome back, Michael.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about Google Translate is that, and I think we mentioned this when we had our preliminary discussion about this, if it's an archaic use of a phrase, it's not going to like it, or it might not translate it correctly, if at all, or if a document, as some do, have words from several different languages, if they throw a bit of Latin in there, because sometimes they do this just to confuse us, but if the rest of it is entirely in German or Dutch or whatever, Google may guess or just throw it back at you or do something silly. So you know, use it as a starting point. It's like a lot of other things. Use these as a starting point to kind of get you started, because sometimes getting started, like she said in I think it was the third or fourth step, that's 90% of it. Sometimes is just getting started. You know.
To give you an example of a Google Translate, in German, the word for a pensioner, one word for pensioner is Rentier, spelled R-E-N-T-I-E-R. That same word, however, can also be pronounced reindeer, and that means a reindeer. So one time I typed it into Google Translate, and then I typed in it was the pensioner bought land, and it said the reindeer bought land. So you don't know the double meanings of words. Sometimes that can be tricky too.
Well, and especially if that pensioner was named Rudolph, right?
That's true, yeah. Maybe it was him. We don't know.
You know, Jim has always given me a hard time for Trottvetter examples, but when I put in phrases into Google that have that last name in there, it translates it because it's a German word.
Yeah.
And the first time it really kind of threw me because it would go on and on and on and on. Beloved cousin, this and that, the beloved cousin. I'm like, who's the beloved cousin? Well, it's translating the That's how it was translating the last name. And you know, it's like a lot of other things. You've got to always keep thinking, starting point and interpreting things in context.
Right. Just take it with a grain of salt. Use it, but try to be smart about it.
So guys, thank you so much. Did you guys have any last minute tips for any of our guests?
Well, I'm seeing Janice Allison's comment about Truman State, and it makes a good point that the names of things can change, because if memory serves, it wasn't always Truman State. What was it called before that?
That was my college I went to. That used to be Northeastern. I think actually Janice went there when it's
in Kirksville, right?
It's in Kirksville. Yeah, it's Kirksville, Missouri.
Yeah, I know where that's at.
Oh, that's nice.
That's not too far from where I grew up. But names can change, so that throws flies in the ointments of all the things we've all talked about today. Place names can change too, in addition to other.
That's a whole show. I love
that is a whole show.
And maps.
Whenever we can cure presentism of thinking that what it's like today is exactly the same as in the past, you'll be a better genealogist.
Oh, I thought presentism was when I need to get a present. Okay, you mean something else. All right. Don't jump to conclusions. There's your other bit of advice for the day too.
Katie, how can people get in touch with you?
They can go to my website, which is sktranslations.com. That's my initials backwards. Everyone always asked what that means. And I have a newsletter. You're welcome to sign up for my newsletter. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
So that ends another episode. 2 episodes. Oh my God, 2 episodes of Genealogy Quick Start. Jim, Michael, Katie, thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I think we got up to about 48. So thank you. And talk to you soon.
Thank you, Shamel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't drop.